everybody. Hello. Okay, welcome to today's colloquium. Let me just tell you that the next colloquium will be delivered by David Bindman, and he'll be speaking on painting the 18th century Caribbean Brunias in the Lesser Antilles. And for now, please welcome to the podium Tommy Shelby, Professor of African American Studies and of Philosophy here at Harvard.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Myisha Cherry this afternoon. Is it okay if I call you Myisha? Okay. Myisha earned her bachelor's degree in philosophy at Morgan State University, a master's of divinity at Howard University, and is currently completing her dissertation for the PhD in philosophy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Her research interests include moral psychology, social and political philosophy, 17th and 18th century sentimentalism, and African American philosophy. She's published a number of papers in these areas in academic journals and in edited collections, and is herself co-editing a book with Owen Flanagan from Duke University titled The Moral Psychology of Anger. She's quite a gifted public speaker, and she has given numerous academic talks, conference presentations, and public lectures on a wide range of topics, including anger, love, forgiveness, empathy, masculinity, sexuality, state violence, and mass incarceration. Myisha has played an active and visible role in taking philosophy outside academic journals and the classroom to a broader public. For instance, she has written public philosophy op-eds for the Los Angeles Times and Salon, and is a regular contributor to the Huffington Post. She's contributed essays to volumes in the influential philosophy and popular culture series published by Open Court. She's given a TEDx talk and was a featured guest on BET. And she hosts and produces the excellent Unmute podcast, where she interviews a diverse set of philosophers about their work and its relevance to public affairs. She's also worked in various capacities to help bring more women and people of color into the discipline of philosophy. In addition to being a Du Bois Fellow, Myisha is a recipient of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics Graduate Fellowship here at Harvard, and also the Santayana Fellowship from the Philosophy Department here at Harvard. She is a former lecturer at CUNY, St. John's University, St. Francis College, and Long Island University, where she taught courses in moral philosophy, philosophy of religion, and ethics and law. And I'm delighted to say that she will be taking up a tenure-track position in the philosophy department at the University of California, Riverside in fall 2018. Her talk today is titled, Can You Find It in Your Heart to Forgive, Race, Request, and Repair? Please welcome Myisha Cherry.
Thank you, Tommy, so much for that introduction, as well as your mentorship, and for being behind bringing me here to Harvard last year. My time here has been invaluable. You know, Harvard is a special space, not because of its name, but because of the names of the people in this room who believe in investing in people and in knowledge production. So I do not take the opportunity to be here for granted. I'm also grateful to Sam Flashacker and my committee at UIC for supporting me and being here. And I'm looking forward to continue to grow and to learn as a fellow at the Hutchins Center this fall. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm also especially happy to see the faces of my comrades from the philosophy department, the Divinity School, and the Safra Center. Some of you all have missed meetings and classes to prove your love. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. So let's begin. So philosophers of forgiveness have tended to focus on three major themes. Number one, what is forgiveness? Who has a standing to forgive? And if forgiveness is a virtue, if it is, then when is it and when is it not? And you will notice that these themes seem to focus primarily on victims. I, on the other hand, am interested in requests for and about forgiveness. So I'm not concerned about what victims do, but what parties, particularly third parties, do in engaging with and responding to victims publicly. So my focus is not on how we should answer this question, if we should answer this question, but my focus is on the question itself. What motivates it? What does it do in the world? So today I'm not going to focus on if victims should or should not forgive, and when they do it, if they have done it properly, but I want to turn the evaluative microscope on us as requesters. So I've been obsessed with something I call the hurry and bury ritual for the last few years. And we can see this ritual take place in high-profile cases of police brutality, state violence, and also anti-Black racism. So here are some examples of the cases that I know you all are familiar with. In 2006, Philando Castile was shot by an officer in Minnesota. When his mother was interviewed, the reporter says this is the kind of old school question. I'm not making a statement about you here, but Congressman Lewis said, I was beaten bloody by police officers, but I never hated them. Taking this as an implicit request for forgiveness, his mother responds, you can forgive sometimes, but you'll never forget. But he took my son's life. I can't forget that. I can't forgive him, bottom line. We also see another case in June 17, 2015. White supremacist Dylann Roof entered an African-American church and killed 9 individuals. A month following that, Samuel DuBois was shot in the head by an officer in Cincinnati, Ohio. A reporter speaking to his mother says, you're obviously a person of faith. Do you see it in your heart to forgive this person, this officer, whether he's convicted or not? She responds, if he asks for forgiveness, oh yeah, I can forgive anybody. God forgave us. We also notice that in the hearing of Dylann Roof, which was very, very unorthodox, the judge begins the hearing with these words, we must find it in our heart at some point in time, not only to help those that are victims, but to also help his family, his being Dylann Roof as well. And then he allows the victim families to speak, and the daughter of Ethan Lance says, you took something very precious away from me. I will never be able to hold her again, but I forgive you. If God forgives, I forgive you. We also notice in 2014, Eric Gardner died in Staten Island by the hands of police officers in what appeared to be a legal chokehold. And also we have Trayvon Martin, who was shot by George Zimmerman, in which some consider a case of police brutality. In a non-indictment press conference, the reporter asked Mrs. Gardner, can the family have it in their heart to accept the officer's apology? And she responds, anybody remember the response? Hell no. All right. And then we also have the reporter, this is after the indictment of George Zimmerman, after he makes an apology. The reporter speaks to the parents of Trayvon Martin. Because he extended an apology to you, will you ever find it in your heart to forgive this man? His mother responds, maybe in a few years, but it's just really difficult right now. And his father responds, I think it's really too much to ask of us to forgive the God that doesn't even regret taking our son's life. And he's even recorded to suggest that it was God's will for that to occur that night. So I call this the hurry and bury ritual because I believe that it is the ritual of asking for and about the forgiveness of Black victims of anti-Black racism, white violence, and state violence. And this is what I want to argue today, that requesters intend to spark forgiveness through the request. This is a charitable reading. If they did not intend, I think that would be too easy for me to criticize. But let's just imagine that the requester intends to spark forgiveness through the request. But given the U.S. racial context, these requests have certain features, all right? And they have these features no matter the intent. And we can imagine if we were in a different U.S. racial context, perhaps they will not have these features, but this is the context in which we live. These features actually show disrespect for the victim, and at least in some cases, they therefore could block instead of spark forgiveness. And so therefore, I want to argue that requesters have moral reasons to resist requesting, all right? So I want to clarify 2 particular terms that I'll be using throughout this presentation. That is what I mean by forgiveness and also what I mean by disrespect, all right? So I want to take a kind of different view than a lot of philosophers, but this is an enlightenment with philosophers such as Alice McLachlan and Kate Norlock, that I do not want to suggest that forgiveness is just one thing. I want to suggest that it can be a variety of moral practices. But no matter what that moral practice is, whether that is giving up anger, whether that is giving up hatred, that is going to have these particular aims. It's going to aim for release for the victim, relief for the offender, and repair between both. All right? And simply what I mean by disrespect is not to assign worth to a subject or give it due consideration and recognition in our behavior, beliefs, and attitudes. So to disrespect someone, I don't necessarily need to have a disrespectful belief or attitude, but my behavior itself can be disrespectful, all right? So this is how we're going to proceed. I'm going to lay out 3 features of the request. Hopefully we get to 3. I'm going to kind of get us to consider rationally why one would be tempted to make such a request. How do these requests disrespect victims? How they could possibly block forgiveness, and then I'm going to offer up some possible alternatives, all right? So let's look at the first feature, which I will call quick requests, all right? So the word quick can be quite subjective, right? If you've ever been in a relationship and moved on, some people may have suggested that you moved on too quickly, but for you, it was just enough time. So quick can be quite subjective, so I want to kind of give what I mean by this. So what I mean by quick requests is that if we have reason to be uncertain, that now is the appropriate time to ask. And this can be due to physical time and also closure, right? So if we look at these particular cases in which the requests were made, in the case of Castile, they were made 1 day after the death, 10 days after the death in the case of DeBoss, Charleston 9, 2 days, and Trayvon Martin 5 months, right? So here we see that the requests were made kind of quickly in regards to time, but it was also made in regards to closure, and we see Sabrina Fulton kind of indicating that closure. In a lot of respects, the body has not even been buried. In a lot of respects, there have not been any indictments. There was an acquittal. The offender did not adequately apologize or at least admit to such wrongdoing. So there's an issue of quickness here. So let's try to imagine, why would a requester ask the request in this particular time frame, right? So it could be the case that they're trying to do a kind of preventative method, right? That if they quickly ask this, perhaps violence would not ensue, right? And there are 2 particular reasons to kind of support this particular worry, right? There is what I call a moral psychological reason that has to do with anger, and also a social empirical reason, right? So there are people who think that, particularly if forgiveness is about giving up anger, that if one is angry, that one is prone to commit violence, right? That one cannot help themselves. So we have Izzard suggesting that the action tendency of anger is retaliation, that once we get angry, we have to retaliate. We can't help ourselves, right? We also have philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who believes that anger is conceptually about payback, that anger and retribution is closely connected, and she even recommends, instead of getting angry, that the best way to respond to great injustice is through love. I disagree with that, but we can talk about that another time. And then we have Jonathan Haidt, who simply suggests that anger comes with an inclination to attack, to humiliate, or to get the person back. So what is my response to this? Quite quickly, I think that the link between anger and aggression is overemphasized, particularly because we get more angry than we get violent. And also there's a connection to aggression with other emotions, and it's not just limited to anger. So for example, people are prone to be aggressive when they are shameful, when they are fearful, when they are guilty, right? But there's also a social empirical reason why someone will be tempted to make such a quick request, right? Think about it. When Black people quickly get angry, this happens, right? The 1992 LA riots, the 2001 unrest in Cincinnati, and then the latest situation in Baltimore, right? So we have to quickly ask the victims to forgive. Perhaps their forgiveness will have an impact on the people in their community, and we won't see situations like this. So my response to this worry is that the link between quick anger of Blacks and unrest is also a myth, right? And I like to call this line of thinking #fake news, right? So you have this idea that there's a particular harm that occurs. Black people quickly get angry as a result of that particular harm, and then there is unrest. However, in reality, it's cumulative harms that occurs, right? It's the fact that Black people keep getting killed by the police, right? That there is constantly no indictment, there's no accountability. And this anger has always been there. It was simmering, and then it comes into a boiling anger, and then we may or may not have unrest, all right? And if we look at the case of the LA riots, for example, it wasn't until a year later after the acquittal of the police officer that we have the riots, right? So black people had anger for like 365 days, right? So it wasn't a quick need to make these particular requests, right? And what I think is really happening here is that what black people experience is what we call black rage. It's non-pathological, it's at the repeated slights, and it's not just because of the violence, but the lack of civic responsiveness to such suffering and such violence, all right? So how does these quick requests disrespect victims? Well, I think that it minimizes the damage. When we quickly ask these victims to forgive, it minimizes the damage. And I think it does this by violating what I call the too soon norm, all right? So the too soon norm, you all have probably used this when someone has made a joke and you basically look at them and says, too soon. The too soon norm suggests that an event has such a tragic weight that it's too soon to respond to it in any particular way right now, right? And to do so is to minimize the harm by not responding to it with the care that it deserves, thus violating the norm, right? So we see kind of this expression in minimizing the damage. Stacey Patton wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post, and she was particularly talking about victims forgiven in this particular case. We can talk about this at another time, but I want to use this for a reflection. She says, if we, African Americans, really believe that Black Lives Matter, we won't devalue our reality, cheapen our forgiveness by giving it away, that is forgiveness, away so quickly and easily. Because I'm not addressing what victims do, I would revise and remix this for requests by suggesting if you really believe that Black Lives Matter, you won't devalue their reality and cheapen their damage by quickly requesting that they forgive, right? So the quick request not only minimizes the damage, but I also believe that it shows a lack of empathy for victims, right? And I think Shauna DeVega captured this in a Salon.com op-ed. She says, quote, "A lack of empathy from white America towards Black America is central to the ritual. If white folks could truly feel the pain of Black people and other oppressed people in these times of meanness, cruelty, and violence, then immediate forgiveness would not be an expectation, all right? So we see that these quick requests, they show a lack of empathy. They also minimizes the damage. But how could these requests block forgiveness as well, all right? Because it's not just a disrespect, but we also, in some cases, it could block forgiveness. Well, we could think that it blocks forgiveness by the fact that we can't forgive what is being asked for, right? So if the requester believes that the damage that has actually occurred is a minimal damage, right, or minimal harm, then we can't forgive what is being asked because we think not that a minimal harm that has occurred, but a huge harm, a grand harm has occurred, all right? So think about this. We have a quick request. The person is requesting us forgive this minimal harm, but actually what has happened is the actual grand damage. So we can't really honor this request because that's not the particular reality. Now, someone may object and says, well, Myisha, you could still forgive the actual damage, right? You can say, well, you're asking me to forgive this. I can't forgive this because that's the reality, but I can forgive what actually happened. But in response to that, I want to suggest that not confirming the actual harm that has occurred or the damage that has occurred does have effect on victims' forgiveness, all right? I got some empirical evidence to back this up. So Judy Eaton and colleagues in 2006 did a study, and they found that when we talk to victims, particularly third parties, when we tell them that we understand that this has happened to them, that we get the gravity, that if we were in their situation, given what has occurred, we can understand why they would feel this way. And what is happening here is that this leads to what they call perceptual validation, right? That we are validating the experience or the way in which the victim has perceived the turn of events, right? And when we do that, when we let them know that, you know what, grand damage has actually occurred to you, what this does is this helps them to forgive. However, I want to suggest when we don't do that, right, when we target the minimized damage, when we communicate to them that what they have experienced is not really what they have experienced, I want to suggest that it doesn't have a positive effect on forgiveness, all right? So that's the first feature. The first feature is that these requests can be quick, not always the case, but they will have the feature of quickness. The second feature is that usually these requests has kind of what I called a false narrative request. We have some people who understand meme language, all right? Okay, so I tend to think that requests are not just questions, but they're also part of story making. So I think that all requests kind of strive for a narrative of sorts. In the case that we're interested in, I want to suggest that these requests seek to tell a story, right? It seeks to tell a normative story, what one should do or should not do. But it also seeks to tell an identity story, who we are, who this particular person is. And the type of story that the requests will tell will be based on the exchange that actually occurs between the requester and the victim, right? But I also want to suggest that there will always be a dose of fiction and fantasy connected to this particular story. So let me give you an example. Let's go back to Charleston, right? We have the judge. We must find it in our heart at some point in time, not only to help those that are victims, but to also help his family as well. And then we had the family of DePayne Proctor, who says, for me, I'm a work in progress, and I acknowledge that I'm very angry. We have no room for hate. We have to forgive. And I would like to call this exchange the oh yes exchange, right? And if this exchange occurs, then this is the story that occurs. There's a normative story. It tells us that we should forgive. That's what we should do. And the identity story is, who are we really, right? And in this particular story, what it tells us is that we are strong, that we're united, that we're resilient, that we're not racist, right? And I want to suggest that the risk of telling this identity story is that it leads us to tell a fantasy, all right? So we see this normative story play out in a Fox News interview right after the hearing. Charleston judge suggests, I set the tone of my court. Our community is hurt. People have to reach out and tell them it's good to grieve. It's best to learn how to forgive. And this is a judge speaking, right? And the identity story that he tells in that interview, he says, quote, you saw what these people did. These people in Charleston, our citizens, they hurt, but they will learn how to forgive. This is the identity story that he is telling. We not only see this in the mouth of the judge, the story that is being told, but we also see this in the media, right? You see the time, what it takes to forgive a killer, right? This normative story. We also see in the Daily News, we forgive you, hate won't win. This is our identity, we, the James Baldwin we, right? We also see another exchange. So the reporter talks to Ms. Gardner again. Can the family have it in their heart to accept the officer's apology? And she responds, hell no. Time for remorse would have been when my husband was yelling to breathe. And I call this the hell no exchange. And the normative story that is usually told through this exchange is, it tells us what we should not do, right? We shouldn't withhold forgiveness. And the identity story, which is quite different in the hell no exchange than the oh yes exchange, it doesn't tell us who we are. It tells us who she is, right? She is bitter, she's angry, she's unchristian, and I want to suggest that this is a fiction. So we see this play out in the media, which is very different in the Charleston case. Eric Gardner's wife lashes out at a cop who killed her husband. She's the angry black woman in this case. Hell no, Eric Gardner's widow rejects officer's condolences. Oh, he gave her condolences, she rejects it. This is who she is. Wife's fury after the cop who killed Eric Gardner's offers family his condolences. So we see a different story being told in this particular case, all right? So why would one be tempted to try to tell a story, particularly a story in the oh yes exchange? Well, perhaps it will increase morale in a time of crisis, right? See, there's a lot of white guilt when this stuff happens. Right? People trying to figure out how we can make sense of a whole bunch of this. And our morale needs to be increased in this, but we need to be united, right? So we can see kind of the utility of such a story. But I want to suggest that these narrative requests disrespects victims. So how does it do it? Well, it does it by romanticizing the reality of the victims, all right? I think Roxane Gay does an excellent job in the New York Times describing this. She says, it's much easier to introduce forgiveness into the conversation than to sit with the reality and consider all who are complicit. White people embrace narratives about forgiveness so that they can pretend the world is a fairer place, that racism is merely a vestige of a painful past instead of this indelible part of our present, right? So it seeks to tell kind of this romanticized version as opposed to dealing with the reality that we live in. They hope to paint a different picture. Like I said before, it is a fantasy, but it helps them to deal with a particular present. So it romanticizes the reality of victims. It also, I think, romanticizes the forgiver, all right? And at the same time, it normalizes the oppression. So philosopher Robin James, in her book Resilience and Melancholy, has a very interesting concept which she calls resilience discourse, right? And she describes it as such. She says, resilience discourse follows a very specific logic. First, damage is incited and made manifest. Second, that damage is spectacularly overcome. And that overcoming is broadcast and are shared. So that third, the person who has overcome is rewarded with increased human capital, status, and other forms of recognitions and recompense. Because finally, and most importantly, this individual's own resilience boosts society's resilience, end quote. So what does this mean? She's particularly kind of thinking about pop culture. And I think the song that kind of comes to mind, for example, is Destiny's Child, Survival, for example. Were you all thinking that? Okay. And you have this notion of Beyonce survive. I mean, in her survival in some ways makes us feel that we can survive the world. And we reward Beyonce for such survival, but we never address the damage that she overcome to survive. Does anyone know even what she survived in that song? Exactly, right? But we give her human capital and we take her resilience as our own. But what happens as a result of romanticizing this resilience, the person who has been resilient, is that the oppression stays the same, right? We never dissect, evaluate, or seek to transform the very thing that one needs to overcome. So what we have is a society of overcomers, constantly, but we never address the particular oppression, all right? So I also think that not only does it romanticizes the forgiver and normalizes the oppression, but it also denies Black victimhood. Now, I know the notion of Black victimhood has been, or even victimhood in general, to embrace such an identity has been quite controversial in feminist literature and also Black literature. But I want us to kind of think about this for a moment, right? Black people aren't allowed to be victims, right? I think that the quick move to move them from victim to forgiver in some ways is not to respect the fact that Black people hurt too. All right. Now, there has been a debate between Shelby Steele and Bell Hooks, and one of the issues between the two, one of the things that they do have in common is this notion that to accept a victimhood or a victim identity, particularly Black identity, and in some way is to not lay hold or to grab one's agency. Right? For bell hooks, it is to be complacent, right? It's to settle for sympathy as opposed to fighting for one's rights or gaining one's particular rights, right? And I understand this worry, but I think, I'm not a Buddhist, but I think there's a middle way here, right? I think that one can admit that there is racist aggression, admit that one is the victim of such, and also continue to maintain their particular agency. So how is such a thing possible? Well, it's possible because I think that victimhood, and let me just say this, I've been taking Spanish for the last year, so let me kind of show you all what I've learned. So in Spanish, there's a difference between ser and estar. Are you guys familiar with this? All right. And ser is like the permanent identity, right? It's who you are, right? It's your name. I am Myisha, and I will remain Myisha until the day I die. Okay, even when I'm dead, I will still remain Myisha. But then there's also the estar, right? Estar is the temporary identity, right? Estoy en el evento, right? I am in this room, right? This is a temporary location, right? And I think the worry for Black victimhood, particularly the language, is the worry that this is a permanent kind of identity, that one has no way out, that this is who one is. But I think we can accept the fact that victimhood isn't a star, right? It's a temporary location, right? It's where I am right now. It's not where I'm going to stay. But until I admit that this is where I am, I can't go forward, all right? So I think this kind of Black victimhood, this star, is a moral notion, right? That it acknowledges that one has been wronged or injured, all right? To suggest or to say that I am a victim of police brutality is to admit that I have been wronged or injured by someone else, right? But it's also a metaphysical notion, right? It's a claim to humanity, right? It's to admit that I'm not a superhuman and that I'm not a stoic human, right? So there was a study not too long ago in which participants were shown a movie or a video of different hands from different racial groups. And the hand is being poked by a pen. And the participants were being judged in their ability to empathize for the particular person whose hand was being pressed with the pen. What they found out is that more participants empathize for white hands than they empathize for black hands, feeling the same amount of pain. And the reason for such is the belief that black people don't experience pain as much as white people, right? Now, it is this idea, one of the things that the researchers suggest is that they believe that because black people have just survived so much, that they have an immunity to physical and mental pain, right? That is a myth, right? So to claim that I am human is to suggest that I feel pain. I'm not superhuman, right? But I'm also not a stoic human, right? The Stoics, no matter what comes, think of other things could be worse, right? This mental capacity not to really deal with one situation. It's to admit that not only do I feel pain, but physically and mentally, that's my experience as well, all right? So there's a wonderful quote by Julissa Jones in kind of capturing this idea of embracing one's humanity. She suggests, quote, "We, African Americans, aren't afforded to show the full range of humanity. We aren't allowed to waver. We're either demons or saints." And I think that sort of superhuman, that sort of super Negro narrative is really still harmful to us because it's been so heavily indoctrinated into American culture. We aren't afforded the luxury to experience our pain, right? And as much as it may be considered to outsiders as a virtue that black people can deal with stuff, right, I would suggest that it's an example of dehumanization. So not only is it a metaphysical notion, but I also think that embracing black victimhood or admitting black victimhood is also a political notion, right? To say that I am a victim of anti-black racism or state violence gives me standing to make certain demands, right? That this has happened to me, and so therefore I am demanding that I get something in return. It also gives political reason to resist the source of such victimization, right? And it also gives political reason to prevent the source of such victimization, right? So I think embracing black victimhood, right, the temporary form, is a metaphysical, moral, and political notion that I think is very useful and also very necessary. So how could it block forgiveness, right? So I think that it lessens the incentive to forgive, right? So we can imagine that this narrative or the story is being told that black people can just survive anything, that they're not actual victims. And I think that black people knowing this, what incentive do we have if the narrative is false? So for example, if the narrative is, we want to hear that you have forgiven, but in reality, black people understand that no one wants to hear our painful reality, right? There's no incentive to forgive, right? If there's an initiative to show that good can triumph over evil or over bad, but in reality, no one wants to admit the degree of the bad and ways to eliminate it. What incentive is there to forgive, right? If the false narrative wants to relieve white guilt, but as white guilt is being relieved, black people are still not safe, what incentive is there to forgive, all right? So then there's a final feature. So we have that these requests can be quick. These requests can have a false narrative, but these requests can also be what I believe is asymmetrical, all right? So I think the first thought that kind of comes to mind when we think about an asymmetry is what I believe is general asymmetry. So what we notice in a lot of these reports is that black victims are asked this question, while other victims, particularly white victims, are not, right? So we had these instances in which the state or white offenders are committing acts of violence against black offenders, and then we see these requests of forgiveness taking place in the public sphere, but we do not see them in cases in which there are black offenders, and the victims are whites or state folks. So here's an example here. So you think about the 5 cases that I raised in the beginning of this talk, and if we was to compare this to other high-profile cases in which black people were the offenders, right? So you all remember in 2002, the DC snipers, right? 2013, we have the Washington Navy Yard, African-American went in and shot some folks. 2013, ex-cop Chris Donner did kind of a revenge police shooting. Are you all familiar with that? He believed that the LAPD was racist, and he kind of went off after some individuals. In 2016, we had the Dallas police shooting. And then in 2017, most recently, we have the Muslim cop, black Muslim cop, who killed the Australian woman, right? And neither of these cases do we hear any public request for forgiveness, right? So you see the little blue there is deceiving. I just wanted to put some blue up there, so I had to put a fake number. But in none of these cases, do we see requests being offered up. So we see already that there's an asymmetry, right? That most of these requests, or all of these requests, are being offered in the cases of black offenders, white offenders, but not in the reverse. So how can we explain why this general asymmetry exists? Well, it could be the case in the high-profile cases that I just listed, that we don't respond that way to terrorists, right? Terrorists are not citizens, they're enemies, right? We don't respond this way to cop killers, right? They have already shown that they're not interested in any type of repair whatsoever, right? Another explanation could be, which I don't think anybody would admit, but we honestly believe in the fact that state institutions can be redeemed, right? That particularly white male offenders can be redeemed, so much so that they're worthy of forgiveness. But we don't think, in my opinion, that black folks can be redeemed. An example of this is how we treat them in the criminal justice system, right? But I want to suggest that even if we were to equal out the request, right, and make it so that the requests are offered in both of those cases, I want to suggest that making the request symmetrical would not make everything okay. And this is because I think that not only does a general asymmetry exist, but also a moral asymmetry, right? So I want to argue that asking for forgiveness in the racial context has a different valence, right? So I want to borrow an argument from Larry Bloom. He's kind of responsible for this. And this is his argument for asymmetrical racism, right? So Larry argues this. He says, all instances of racism are wrong, but given the history, pattern of racist acts, and power relations, some racism is more wrong than others. White racism differs symmetrically in history, patterns of racist acts, and power relations than black racism. Therefore, he argues, white racism is morally worse than black racism. And we can debate this all day, if it's even possible for there to be the black racism. Is it bad or is it worse? But I just want us to think about the structure for a little bit, because I want to borrow this kind of line of thinking to my argument. So I want to suggest that forgiveness requests are not always wrong or inappropriate. But given the racial history, the pattern of acts, and the asymmetrical oppression and power relations, requests in some contexts are more wrong than others. Requests for blacks to forgive anti-black racism or state violence is to ask them to forgive given the content of what's located in premise 2. Therefore, making such requests of blacks has a different valence. It's negative, more negative than requests in other contexts. All right. So if this is the case, right, that there is a general asymmetry, but there's also a moral asymmetry, why would anyone make such an asymmetrical request? So let's be charitable here. It could be the case that they are appealing to the agency of black victims, right? That they understand that there's not much that black victims can do in this case, but forgive, right? So let's interrogate what they can do. Let's have a discussion about what they can do. Let's remind them about what they can actually do in the world, all right? It also could be the case that it's generally asymmetrical is because the stakes are a little higher in these particular cases, right? That when blacks are victims, right, it may cause a little bit more problems, right? It brings the race conversation back into the forefront. It brings our history, it brings our progress back into inspection, right? So the stakes are a little higher. But I want to suggest that no matter how rational it may be, that these requests disrespect victims. So how does it do it? First of all, I think that it reifies a racial hierarchy, right? So I've already suggested in the explanation number 2, there is some assumption that white offenders are redeemable, but blacks are not, right? And this just contributes to the racial hierarchy, right? That whites in some way are morally better, right? Are metaphysically better than blacks, right? So I think in making the general asymmetrical request, it reifies that particular racial hierarchy, right? I also think that it communicates an unreciprocal moral and civic duty to black victims, right? What do I mean by this? It simply suggests that black victims just have a higher obligation in the moral sphere than white folk, right? And we see kind of this resistance of unreciprocal moral and civic duties in the exchange with Mrs. Gardner. So let's return back to her response. She says, the time for remorse was when my husband was yelling to breathe. That would have been the time for him to show remorse for another human being when he was screaming 11 times to breathe. So let's think about this for a moment, right? She's basically suggesting you're asking me to follow through or to obey my civic and moral virtues. But this officer did not do any of it, right? He had the time to, right? He could have shown remorse, right? He could have morally responded to my husband in a particular way. And mind you, she not only says husband, but she says he's a human being, right? Trying to presenting him as an actual human being. And she says that the officer had 11 times to respond morally and civically, right? And so in this way, I see her suggesting that he had a time to respond to my husband morally and civically, but he did not. But you're asking me to do the same, right? She recognizes the unreciprocal civic and moral obligation that is being imposed against her. And thirdly, I think that it disrespects victims, given the racist history, that it kind of sends an invitation to acquiesce in times of oppression. And most of the criticism that has revolved around these requests of forgiveness kind of implies that what white folk or whoever is asking the request is actually asking black people to sit down, be calm, don't say anything, keep it moving, love, and things will get better, right? So how does morally and generally asymmetrical requests block forgiveness? Well, I think, as in the examples that I've shown with the hell no exchange, that it makes victims resistant to forgiveness, right? When you basically tell me that there are some things that I should do that other citizens are not obligated to do, that I become resistant to it. When you tell me that I must acquiesce to oppression, then if a person is self-respecting, then they will have the temptation to resist such a request, all right? So in summary, we've said that these requests made in this particular racial context, in the context of racial violence, anti-black racism, and state violence, that these requests are quick, they present a false narrative, and they're asymmetrical. And these requests disrespect victims, and in some cases, they could also block forgiveness, and so we have reasons to resist requesting. So, Myisha, if this is the case, then what are some possible alternatives? All right. So think about this. The victim is standing before reporters. They have an opportunity to speak. And so if you are a reporter or any citizen in the room, how can you maximize this space in which the victim could speak? And I want to suggest that there are particular questions that one can ask that can still get you the aims of forgiveness. Once again, I said that the aims of forgiveness is relief for the offender, release for the victim, and also repair for both. How can we get those particular moral aims without the risks of disrespecting the victim? I suggest we can ask, what has this done to you? Right? Seems like a simple question, but it's an opportunity to present a real reality. Yeah, a real reality, right? It's an opportunity for the victim to explain not a fantasy, right, but a nonfiction reality, what it is like to be on the ground. It's also an opportunity for the victim to be a victim, right, to express how this has affected them. And it's also, we can ask the question, what can we do for you? Right? So I want you to think about this. Can you imagine if the reporter, as opposed to asking, can you find it in your heart to forgive, the reporter, knowing what his job is, asks the victim, what can I as a reporter do for you? Can you imagine how powerful a moment that would have been? Can you imagine what the victim would have said to the reporter and what we would have read the next day, right? And I think what is powerful about this particular question is that as opposed to asking what the victim is going to do, right? It simply suggests is that we're not leaving it all up to you to respond, but we also understand that we as citizens also has a moral obligation, a civic obligation to respond to this as well, right? And third, I think that another question that can be asked is, what do you want to occur, right? And I think that this question is quite different than what I can do for you. What can we do for you? Perhaps only a citizen can do but so much. But I think the latter question is an institutional response, right? Perhaps they would have responded, I want justice to occur, right? And I think that this is a question that allow us to kind of inspect how can we move the victim from the Astar location, right? The temporary location of victimization to a better position, a transformation position, a safe position, not only for that particular victim, but for blacks as well. Right? So let's talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the part that I heard. I'm sorry I was at a New England Baptist Hospital doctor's appointment, as I hope you heard.
Yes, I've heard.
And so I apologize for being late. When I was growing up, and I'll be 67 in a few days, right? I don't recall, and someone here can correct me, but I don't recall within the race this debate about if black people could be racist or not. I don't think Martin Luther King, and again, I can be corrected, entertained the idea that a black racist is any different than a white racist. And I used to have this argument with Spike Lee all the time, who we hired 26 years ago to teach right here. And frankly, that was the first time I ever heard of it. What is the history of this idea? Not to get into.
Yeah.
Obviously, I have problems. I mean, the whole idea, to me, a racist is a racist.
Yeah.
Racism is racism. A black racist is as bad as a white racist.
Yeah.
That's how I feel. But I'm more interested in trying to ask a neutral question.
Yeah.
What's the history of the idea? Because it doesn't have a long history, in my experience.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm not a historian on this, right? I'm not a historian of thought. So I don't necessarily know the history. I mean, in some ways, I'm wondering if I could even, that's why I said this is worthy of discussion, if I can defend Larry. But I was using him as inspiration, not defending his particular view. I want to leave it as that. So that's what I would do. But I don't know the history. I don't know the history of the idea. Maybe Tommy knows the history. You do? You want to tell us? We have time. Krishna has the mic.
Yeah, don't worry. We'll field the question.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Tommy, you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to hear you say a little bit more about how much turns on the fact that the request is in public,
Yeah.
and what would change if it was a private request, and also, as a secondary question, like if you thought that it was either not bad or not as bad or not always bad to do it in private, where there might be space for, if you like, tactical requests.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, you gave the case of like the worry in the background that, well, if all this public display of anger just might lead to unrest, or rioting, if you like. If you were trying to engage in some kind of social campaign around a thing, and you thought that setting off such unrest would undermine or to set it back, you might think a private request to if you like, perform forgiveness in public in this way, could be tactically advantageous, and so not as wrong. So I just wonder what your reflections are on that.
Yeah. So my larger project, so this particular chapter, as I kind of preface with, is that I want to deal with public requests, right? I think there's a lot of political work that's being done, not only in conversation with the victim, but as the community as a whole. And so I don't think that work can actually be done in the private sphere, right? There's a reason why it's being asked publicly, right? So I wanted to interrogate that. As far as evaluating the appropriateness of it, Tommy, you know that I have a chapter dedicated to the more appropriateness of these requests done in the private sphere as opposed to the public. And I guess you could say my judgment of what is permissible in public is quite different than when it's transferred to the public sphere. So yeah, I could argue, and I don't necessarily address this particularly in the dissertation, but it could be the case that yes, this works in private, right? But publicly, it does some different work, and I want to interrogate what that work does. And the public does have a lot to do with what's bringing about the features, as well as the context.
So thank you for an incredibly provocative talk. I have like a ton of questions and thoughts, but I just wanted to hone in on two. One would, and they both kind of revolve around your characterization of forgiveness. So I'm most familiar with Hannah Arendt on the topic of forgiveness. So this is kind of the angle that it's coming from. And in her sense of it, which I've always found actually pretty persuasive and powerful, and I think in line with what someone like Martin Luther King is attempting to do with his invocation of the concept, is as a kind of refounding, right? So in your account, it seems to be about a backward reference primarily, so that it obscures what's already happened, it precludes us from dealing with harms that have already been accrued. But
The it is
the
forgiveness.
forgiveness.
I am not saying that, but continue.
Okay. So this is partly what I just
Yeah.
want to clarify is that, there are folks who think that part of what it does is it's a kind of ground clearing practice
Yeah.
that allows for new terms of solidarity, political organization, civic friendship, whatever terms you'd like.
Yeah.
To actually emerge
Yeah.
by releasing people from being overdetermined by their past.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I was just curious to hear you to clarify whether your concept of forgiveness has any of that in that or has some dimension of that to consider. And then secondly, I wanted to put some pressure on the idea that you advanced. I know you had a lot to argue for, but you sort of advanced this idea that we don't make this kind of request to non-blacks about blacks. And I thought that sort of didn't strike me as right, because I think it's pretty conventional part of liberal discourse on crime. Maybe not liberal practice,
Yeah.
thanks to our colleague Elizabeth Hinton, but liberal discourse on crime seems to always suggest that, we should be forgiving of people who commit all sorts of crimes given their social circumstance, and that actually we want to try to forge a better world, and that part of what we need to do in our response to these things is take those circumstances into account and moderate our responses and desires for revenge and punishment accordingly, and that there's something wrong when we don't do that. When I was at Yale, I always remember there was this very anguished white liberal student who wrote an op-ed about how he had gotten robbed over on the area, the Hill? Yeah, off Dixwell Avenue. He got robbed and beat up by some kids with some milk crates. And is very anguished and heartbroken about how he learned to forgive them and needed to forgive them. And so it just seemed like part of the discourse, and I was curious as to how you would think about that, whether that counts as a genuine case of forgiveness in your episteme.
Yeah, so let's think about the location of the discourse, right? So you were talking about in the context of law, and so then my question is, who is actually having that conversation, right? Is it you and theorists, you and liberal theorists alone, right? And so one of the things I want to suggest is that I think there's different discourses happening in different spheres. And this particular sphere that I'm interested in, this is like this public, right after it happens, right? Not just the theorists, but when we all get in a room together, what is being asked of, right? And what I see, and this is just given these particular 5 cases that I'm raising, is that we find it publicly being asked for in certain cases than it is in other cases. Not that it's not being discussed, but the requests are being generated in these particular spaces that I don't see in other spaces, right? It's not to say that we're not thinking about this, that we're not thinking that we should still extend forgiveness to those of different racial backgrounds. But I'm really looking at not just in one space, but the public space. And going back to I would suggest that moving on, you suggest and building up a new sense of community. Is that what you were suggesting about ground clearing. It could be the case that in the repair, for example, is an example of that. So I would say that repair aim kind of encompasses this. I mean, the reason why I think, and I don't know if Iran addresses this, that there are a whole bunch of accounts of forgiveness, and people are pretty dedicated to their account being what forgiveness is. And any account of forgiveness that don't encompass this is a judgment that one has not forgiven. And I think that what is attractive about the multi-dimensional account or the practice-based account that I've offered up, is that whatever moral practice, right? So it's not just a forgetting what actually occurred, but any kind of moral practice with these particular kind of aims seems to appear like what forgiveness is. And it will look different in different cases, in different contexts. So I want it to be as exclusive as possible, so I think it will encompass Harant's account as well.
Thank you. Preston Williams?
Yes.
You have a question?
No.
Questions, comments, please. Yes. Krishna, you want a person in the back?
Hi there. Thanks so much. That was wonderful. I'm Andrew March at the Software Center for Ethics. I know you wanted to not talk too much about what forgiveness is metaphysically or pragmatically, but I was hoping to get some of your help on that. So one of the things that I'm so perplexed about this is that it's sort of like what Brandon was just saying about the public nature of it, what you were saying about so much of the demand, our ethical understanding of the demand is generated by the fact that it is public, it's a performance, it's media, it's asymmetrical. I sort of think that there's a sort of nonsensicalness to this demand for forgiveness, because there are some systems in which, like Brendan said about...
Now, mind you, Andrew, you're saying demands,
so
and you notice that I
idea of
didn't term it
forgiveness.
as such. Yes?
Yeah, the very
Okay.
idea of forgiveness. So, and there are many systems in which what forgiveness is doing is it's a promise to not do something in the future. So let's say in Islamic law, you say you forgive, and the person is exonerated, and the person isn't punished either by public authorities or privately. Now, that's obviously not what's going on. When people say, nobody's saying that the act of forgiveness is meant to preclude the legal system from operating. We all want these people to be punished, and I don't think anybody's saying that their forgiveness is supposed to sort of have any kind of operation on the legal system.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's not really retroactive, because it's not meant to say that what they're doing is something that you forget, something that you don't think was wrong. It seems to only work as some kind of public declaration about what's happening internally, right? It's not a promise not to act in the future or to not forestall any kind of future beginnings. It's not a judgment about the evilness of what happened in the past. It seems to only function as some kind of public witnessing or declaration about the state of somebody's heart. And even that, I don't think I fully understand. They're not saying it wasn't wrong. They're not saying they forget it. So perhaps they're saying that I'm going to orient my heart in a certain way where the hatred that I have towards somebody that made me a victim is not going to consume me or dominate me. Anyway, so I just want to hear, what your sense of what the word even means. What's happening when somebody publicly declares forgiveness, if it can't mean either something retroactive or something prospective. I guess that's, I'm trying to drag you into a sense of what exactly forgiveness is and what exactly we think we're asking of somebody when it happens in public.
Yeah, that's what this talk was about. I'm trying to figure it all out, right? Because usually, I think one of the things I want to suggest is what we think we're asking doesn't matter, right? In some ways, the request can take on a life of its own that we're not necessarily responsible for, but the context kind of dictates. And I think that's what's powerful about the request. And I think that's what is attractive about the request for me, philosophically, right? So that's why I'm not, and that's one of the reasons why I adopted the multidimensional kind of approach to forgiveness. I don't think it's one thing, right? But I think that it's too simple to suggest that that's the only thing that's being asked of. So whatever one takes it to be, right? So let's just say we end up agreeing about what forgiveness is. That's not the end of what's happening in these particular spaces, right? And that's what I'm intrigued by, right? I think there's a lot of miscommunication. I think that what it means for the victim and what it means for the actual requester can be total different things there. We can talk about this later, Andrew. Matter of fact, I can put you to work and you can give me some comments on this. But I also have the idea that I just want to leave the victim out of this for a moment, right? What the victim takes himself to be doing and what happens as a result of that. That I really want us to inspect us. And I'll leave it as that.
Good. Yes.
Well,
I've got the microphone. I'll speak right after you.
Yeah, a hard act to precede. Um, that was wonderful, Myisha. And I'm wondering whether it would be in line with the way you're approaching this to go back and think a bit about anger and what's so wrong with so many of the things you presented.
Yeah.
I learned to think about anger from Audre Lorde, also Martin Luther King, and and a little bit of Aristotle, but mostly Audre Lorde, and to think about it as an emotion of connection, a demand for connection, a saying to the other, we're in this together and you blew it. And we've got to figure out how to be in this together. It's not walking out of the room. It's not shooting.
Yeah.
It's taking the other by the shoulders and saying, look me in the eye. Don't you dare walk away from me because I'm angry as hell and we've got to figure this out. And so it's a demand for acknowledgement, engagement, respect. And when a request for forgiveness doesn't include an awareness that that's what's being demanded, that's what's needed. And I honestly can't imagine requesting forgiveness for pretty much anything. It just seems a weird thing to do. But if it's going to make any sense, it seems to me that it has to be accompanied by a full, deep awareness of that engagement aspect of anger, a getting at why the anger exists, and a commitment to take it up.
I agree. I have nothing to add to that. So here's the thing. Those who know me know I can talk about anger all day. All right? But yeah, I totally agree with you.
No, I agree with her formulation too. But I just want to thank you for such a brilliant paper, though. This distinction so subtle and the insights flowing. The issue of romanticizing the victim and normalizing or even naturalizing the oppression seems to me to have something to do, and you tell me what you think, of the background conditions, which Charles Taylor and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty would call the background conditions for the request. So you think of the reporter raising the question. What assumptions are actually being made? Well, we know a black life has less value than a white life in the history of the country, past and present. We know that most of discourse about race in America has to do with white fears, insecurities, and anxieties, and making sure you don't so thoroughly unsettle them that you must control the black rage, the black anger. And we also know that if you send a sign to other black folk that it's all right to act on your rage, then those insecurities and fears and anxieties are escalated. And then polarization sets in, and then we got a little national discourse on race for about 2 days. You see what I mean? So that those are background conditions for the requester. Now, if the requester then wants to be sincere, honest, candid, can't they make those background conditions part and parcel of the conversation before they even engage in the request? Which is a version of what a sister just said. From what and that's what I see you doing with such clarity and subtlety. Is that a fair characterization of what you're?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, Brother West. I mean, so here's the thing, and I don't want to go into a full discussion of philosophy of mind. Susanna can do that much better than I can, right? But it just goes to show how much background conditions there are when we speak, and background conditions that we don't even know that's there, that we're acting off of, right? And so I think what is interesting about these requests, like I said, I want to be charitable, even with the good intentions, right, of sparking a conversation about how we can move on and repair. Even with those good intentions, not only does it have these features, but it's coming from somewhere, right? Now, I don't spend time in the dissertation kind of inspecting that those background, the subconscious of implicit bias and all that stuff, and how we are kind of influenced by all the media representation about what we think about black bodies and all that stuff. What I want to suggest, all that stuff doesn't matter. Whether it's intentional or not intentional, whether it's conscious or subconscious, that request is still doing work. But I think it goes to show that a lot of stuff, we all have background conditions as informing how we speak, what we say, even when we think that we're the good white person or we think that we're the woke black person, right? There's a lot of stuff informing us. And there's no doubt, Brother West, that we need to interrogate that stuff. That what I think is unique about these requests is that it allows us, or gives us reason, or at least evidence, that it's not just those reporters who are unaware about the background stuff that's going on, right? That even with our good intentions, when we talk virtue, when we talk about what the future is going to look like, all that stuff is also informed by some stuff that I think we also need to interrogate as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Corey. Hey. Hello.
Hello, I haven't seen you since last night.
I know.
We went to a concert, Nas and Lauryn Hill, to be clear.
Less than 24 hours ago. I love this presentation. It was wonderful. As an activist, I've unfortunately / fortunately seen both sides of the ball. I have a distinctive memory of being in the CNN trailer preparing for an interview the day after the non-indictment of Darren Wilson.
Yeah.
And Michael Brown's stepfather, obviously the day before, was on top of a car, and the parents heard the verdict the same exact time as the general public. So his reaction was a genuine reaction. It wasn't a premeditated reaction. It was a genuine emotion. I sat with Leslie at the United Nations and saw her cry to these people. So the topic of forgiveness is, for me, it sparks a little bit of anger, I must admit, because it's very polarizing in a sense to ask the victim to, have empathy for the wrongdoing that's been done against them. So I struggle with that. But I wanted to ask a question as to why do you think the media has these requests for the forgiveness to be so public at the exact moment of the pain resonating with the victim? Even if they were to forgive, it seems kind of illogical for me to ask you how you feel, if you have any remorse or any capacity to show, humanity for the perpetrator of the crime at the highest peak of your emotional valleys going through what you're going through.
Yeah. Goes back to those background conditions, right? So here's the thing. So let me empathize for the requester again. And let me also say this, as you were talking, it made me think about this. I don't want to suggest that the reporters are outliers, right? I think they represent ordinary citizens, right? They're asking a question they think that is relevant because they're in the business of selling papers, right? And selling stories, right? So that this question is not just a question that is only relevant or that the reporter finds interesting, but I think the reporter also finds it of interest to the general public, and that's why it's being asked for, right? So it's not just the reporter who's doing something bad here. I think it's a representation of the citizenry, right? They're also interested in Black victims' forgiveness, right? But it goes back to the background stuff that's happening there, right? I mean, you would think. I mean, we don't do this in cases well, we do. So let me use an example. We don't do this. I want to say that we don't do this in private cases, but I think that would be a lie. But it just goes to show how much background stuff is there, how much we really don't empathize with Black folk. Even when we think that we are, right? Because you would think that, perhaps the requester think that by me asking this question, can you find it in your heart, right? They're doing some kind of psychological, internal kind of conversation with the victim. It's just the wrong kind of internal psychological conversation with the victim, right? And if the requester had a little bit more empathy, less background conditions, it would be a different question. Still with the same aim, but a different question.
That's another thing that would be interesting to historicize. Just this public asking of forgiveness.
Yeah.
I remember being shocked at when the families of victims at Mother Emanuel in Charleston almost immediately announced that they had forgiven Dylan Roof.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, they're much better Christians than I am, 'cause I knew Reverend Pinckney, and
Yeah.
I thought, well, but again, historicizing
Yeah.
the question would be an interesting thing too.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Skip. Because I think black folks have been forgiven for a long time. I mean, the country is still existent. I mean, that is evidence that we have been forgiven since we got here, right?
Well, but you couldn't get into heaven unless you forgave. Because we
so
were the
there's no
most
doubt.
Christian of Christian.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Jesus, God didn't like ugly. No matter what, you
Yeah.
had to forgive. That was
Yeah.
part of the meal ticket to heaven.
Yeah, yeah. And we see in slave narratives, right? Ex-slaves forgiven, right? So us forgiven is not a new thing.
Right.
I think the requests kind of are,
Right.
And it's something that, me not being a historian, that I found some difficulties looking back, and maybe I need to really look at some different archives, but I did not see requests, right? But I've seen kind of articulations or vows of forgiveness.
Okay. Chris, who has the mic? Kristen really controls this thing here.
Thanks. Hi. I don't know if this is a question or just a
Now,
comment.
Myisha is not me. We're different people, by the way.
We get mistaken for each other a lot. So I don't know if this is a question or more of just a comment, but this came. Okay, I will find a way. So I was thinking about journalists asking, "Can you find your heart? Can you find it in your heart to forgive?"
Yeah.
And I was thinking about where that's coming from. And so in my mind, I was thinking, well, it's not necessarily like they don't really necessarily care about whether you have the capacity for forgiveness or not, but it's
Yeah.
more about the collective guilt and the absolution of the group, perhaps. So you're requesting this forgiveness so that we can all feel better about the situation, like the perpetrators are the group that's part of that. But then I had this thought, so I don't know about everybody else, but like as a black person, most of my life, I've kind of felt like a collective shame. So like, for instance, if I'm watching the news and I hear about some heinous crime, I am praying that the person who did it wasn't black. And I think a lot of us feel that way because we would then take on, that shame as well. Like that's another thing we have to
That's
carry.
historical. That's very much
Right.
part of the black tradition.
Right, and most of my none of my white friends feel that, and I've asked them that before, because I think it's an individual thing.
Yeah.
So then when I was thinking, okay, so the journalists are trying to maybe potentially get absolution for the group by asking this question, I then thought, well, maybe that's not true, because do white people feel that collective shame? I don't know. But then it started to make me think, like, maybe it's a transference of guilt instead. So, like, if I ask you the question, can you find it in your heart? And you say, hell no, right?
Yeah.
So now we don't have to feel as badly because your response now puts it
You
now
to
kind of-
shame, you to shame.
Right, so now we're looking at you, well, you can't forgive, as opposed to
Yeah.
thinking about it. So I'm trying to find a way to make this into a question, but does that make sense? Yes, that's a good question.
Skip, I don't know what the question is.
Does that make sense to you, though? I guess my question is, like, do white people feel collective shame? And, do white people
Yeah.
feel collective shame? And if they do, would that then mean that the journalists are trying to absolve themselves of that? Like, or am I just out of left field?
Yeah, I mean, I think that white guilt is real. I think white guilt is real. And that's an empirical question. So as a philosopher, I can make estimations about the extent of white guilt and instances in which it occurs and instances in which it could be denied, and if it's normative to even feel that way. But I think white guilt is real.
You have to break down the concept of white, and you have to historicize it again. In the Jewish tradition, of course, the same thing. It depends on the point in the development of Jewish culture and which country you're talking about. But what a Jew did in public impacted the larger group, and there was an enormous amount of shame, self-censorship.
Yeah.
We're not all like that, just like for black people. Same with Irish Americans. I would say I'm not as familiar with Italian Americans, but I can't imagine it would be any different. I was 12. Now I was just turned 13 when John F. Kennedy was killed. All the black people wanted to know was Lee Harvey Oswald black or not?
Yeah.
All they wanted to know first. Everybody was sad, but was he black? Was it a black man? Was he black? I mean, I remember just as a kid just being shocked at that, and then hoping he wasn't black. But there's no such thing as just white people. There's 250 million people who we call white, but they all come from sub-traditions in the same way that 42 million black people do as well. Anyway,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So let me be messy with my language of guilt, of white, and please forgive me, Skip, right? As Skip was talking, I was thinking about, I want to differentiate between collective guilt and white guilt, right? So I think that collective guilt, which is very different from, I hope it's not a white person, but I think collective guilt is quite different from white guilt, right? So I think collective guilt is an acknowledgement that we're all complicit, right? And that particular guilt is going to lead us to do something about it, right? White guilt is, I feel bad that somebody got shot in Charlottesville, and I probably need to go to my cabin in Vermont and just relax and take a break because this is just really hurting my heart right now, right? And don't talk bad about this and say that it's all white people because it's not, right? So that doesn't lead to transformation, right? But I think collective guilt does. Now, how collective guilt can really occur and what impact it has is an empirical matter, right? But I think there's a difference there.
We have time
Hi.
probably for 2 more questions. Kristen is passing that mic.
Hi, Myisha.
How are you?
Good. Thank you for that. That was brilliant. I loved that you stayed focused on the Speech Act without using Speech Act-y language, and that you resisted certain aspects of intentionalizing, even though I know that moral psychology is something you're really interested in. Because I think you get very different answers if you look at the social practice, and that's what I saw you as doing. So I hope that's a correct reading.
Yes.
And so I wanted to, I liked all the elements you put together, and I think the false narrative and trying to construct a more accurate narrative might be part of why you came up with the alternatives you came up with at the end. And I wanted to maybe put a little pressure on you about them because, like the first one, what has this done to you?
Yeah.
I understand how the answer to that could be a corrective to the dehumanization and not seeing the humanity of the family of the victims. But I also felt like it was so intrusive. And like, for me, and maybe you're gonna say, well, you know, go to your cabin in Vermont, but this is, which I don't have, but this is, it felt really voyeuristic and I know, but it feels very voyeuristic and intrusive. So I was wondering, why not tell people, you know, I'm glad I'm not a reporter, start without a leading question. What do you want to say to my viewing public or to the world right now? What do you want to say? And it could be anything. I understand that if you say, how are you feeling right now, or what has this done to you, then you get at the humanity. And maybe what they want to say won't reveal the humanity in quite the same way. But I kind of just wanted to get you to comment on your 3 alternatives and whether you had other things in mind and whether you're going to develop this more, because I thought it was really interesting. And I think that those do tie back to the structure you created in the body of the paper.
Yeah, so I'm not committed to these questions. I'm really open, so if you guys have any suggestions on how to expand it or amend it. But what I found intriguing about the first question, I was thinking about, so the question can't be what happened, right? Because in these cases, we don't know what happened. Body camera turned off, right? Police lying about what occurred. Information has yet to be released, right? So we can't really get at the facts of the matter, right? But we can get at whatever, we know that this man is dead, right? So tell us, like, what you're feeling right now. And there's something about attesting to that. I can't attest to the facts. I don't know what the facts are, right, in this particular instance. But I can tell you some alternative facts. I can tell you some other facts about how this has actually. So that's one of the things that I was hitting to. And I think kind of in some ways inspired by the TRC just a little bit. And I know I'm gonna be messy with this example. But you think about the hearings of the TRC, they were asked to kind of, you know, tell us what occurred. Now, mind you, in those instances, there still weren't a lot of facts about what occurred, right? And the reason why the victims' hearings were what they were because they wanted to get at what occurred. But still, they had that space, right? And whatever question is able to articulate that space of where they are, right, and how they're feeling and how they're doing, may not be facts proper in some kind of way, But getting at how that has affected them is what I was trying to get at. And I'll take your amendment on that. I'll take your amendment on that, yeah.
It's always tough to be the first fellow to go.
It always sucks, but it's over.
It ain't over till I say it. I'm not the fat lady, but I'm the fat man. But I think that we all agree what a strong and forceful presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.